On a cold afternoon in late December of the year 1976, the quiet borough of East Side, tucked along the winding stretch of the Lehigh River in Carbon County, Pennsylvania, settled into the kind of winter calm that made the world feel muted. The sky hung low with winter clouds, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys that lined the modest neighborhood streets. It was the kind of place where children knew every trail, every bend in the river, and every secret pocket of forest that bordered the town. 14-year-old Kenneth Jumper Jr. was out walking along one of those familiar paths beside the river. He had walked this stretch many times, often carrying traps or checking the riverbank for signs of wildlife. The river had a way of reminding him of the rhythm of each season, and to a young boy who understood the land well, nothing along the trail usually surprised him. But on this particular afternoon, sometime around 4:30, something unfamiliar caught his eye. Just ahead, resting near the cold ground beneath the towering bridge that carried Interstate 80 across the river, sat a suitcase. It was out of place, dark against the frost-touched earth, and large enough to make him stop in his tracks. He moved a little closer, noticing details he did not remember seeing the week before. One moment later, the normal rhythm of the river dissolved. Lying near the suitcase, exposed to the cold December air, was something no 14-year-old should ever have to see. A human head, with dark hair tangled by the winter wind. Kenneth's breath caught in his chest. Shock radiated through him like a wave of ice. The river, the bridge, the hillside, everything that once felt familiar suddenly felt wrong. His instincts pulled him away. He turned and ran, feet pounding the frozen ground until he burst through the front door of his home. He found his 19-year-old brother, Richard, and told him what he had seen. The two of them wasted no time. Within minutes, the Pennsylvania State Police were called. When investigators arrived, they began combing the area beneath the Interstate 80 bridge, their flashlights cutting through the fading daylight. What they found was far more disturbing than a single piece of evidence. Not one, but 3 suitcases, all spray-painted black, lay scattered near the riverbank. Each one had burst open on impact. Inside those suitcases were the dismembered remains of a young woman, along with the nearly full-term unborn daughter she had been carrying. What lay before the investigators was a crime so brutal, so intimate in its violence, that even seasoned officers struggled to process what they were seeing. The frigid air filled with a deep, uneasy silence as they documented each fragment of what had been left behind. The young woman had been strangled. She had been shot once in the neck, and after her death, she had been dismembered. Her unborn child had been removed from her womb, placed inside one of the suitcases as though she were just another piece of discarded evidence. From the very beginning, investigators believed the killer had carried the suitcases onto the bridge above and thrown them over the side, intending for them to disappear into the cold rush of the Lehigh River. But instead of falling into the water, the suitcases struck the rocky embankment below, tearing open and revealing what they were never meant to reveal. The initial autopsy suggested that the young woman had died sometime between the 17th and 20th of December, but later investigations shifted the window, suggesting she had likely been killed within a single day of her discovery, a brutal act committed just hours before Kenneth stumbled upon the first suitcase. Among the contents of the luggage, investigators found pages from the Northern New Jersey edition of the Sunday Daily News, dated late September of that same year. They also found a piece of chenille fabric, possibly torn from a robe or blanket. These small fragments, seemingly insignificant on their own, were among the only clues available in those early days. The woman was believed to be Caucasian, likely in her late teens or early 20s. She was estimated to be about 5 feet and 4 inches tall, weighing around 150 pounds. Disturbingly, her killer had cut off her nose and ears, a mutilation that spoke not only of violence, but of someone intent on erasing her identity completely. Despite the disfigurement, forensic artists created a sketch of what she might have looked like. That sketch was circulated through newspapers, pinned to bulletin boards, shown to local communities, and sent to law enforcement agencies across state lines. But no one recognized her. No family came forward. No missing person report seemed to match. In death, she became known only as Beth Doe, and for a long time, that was all anyone had a name borrowed out of necessity. a symbol of a life erased so thoroughly that she appeared to belong to no one. Her remains were stored at the city morgue in Philadelphia for nearly 7 years, preserved in the hope that one day technology or recognition or luck would give her back the name she had been born with. But answers did not come. Leads dried up. Witness memories faded. Tips scattered into dead ends. Finally, in the late summer of 1983, her remains, along with those of her unborn daughter, were returned to Carbon County. A local pastor presided over their burial in the Carbon County Potter's Field, now known as the Lorrytown Road Cemetery near Weatherly, Pennsylvania. The grave marker was simple, plain. It read only Beth Doe because no one knew what else to write. But something remarkable happened over the years that followed. Even though Beth Doe had no known family at her graveside, the people of Carbon County adopted her. They left flowers. They visited her grave. They prayed for her and for the child buried beside her. They spoke of her as though she belonged to the community because, after so many years without a name, the community had decided she did. Year after year, the case remained frozen, not forgotten, but suspended in a kind of heartbreaking limbo. Facial reconstructions were updated. Isotope analysis was performed. DNA technology evolved. And with each scientific step forward, investigators tried again to identify her. In 2007, her remains were exhumed so that newer forensic evidence could be collected and tested. Dozens of missing person cases from across the country were compared to Beth Doe. One by one, each possibility fell away. She remained a mystery. A young woman whose life had mattered deeply to someone, somewhere, but whose history seemed permanently severed from the brutal way she died. More than 4 decades passed, and then, in the spring of the year 2021, everything changed. But before Dark Case Desk continues, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. The winter of the year 2021 had barely begun to settle when a quiet ripple moved through law enforcement offices in Pennsylvania. A new DNA lead had triggered something investigators had hoped for since the 1970s, a connection strong enough to pierce through 4 decades of uncertainty. It began with a simple notification from a genetic database, the kind used by everyday people searching for their ancestry, reconnecting with relatives, or exploring family mysteries. But this time, the mystery was far darker, and the match far closer than anyone expected. Investigators reached out to a man living hundreds of miles away, a man who had no idea that decades of heartbreak waited behind the call. His name was Evelyn Colon, Jr., and he had grown up hearing fragments of a family tragedy he did not fully understand. He knew of an aunt he had never met, a young girl named Evelyn, who had vanished before he was even born. He knew his family whispered her name with genuine pain, not because she had run away willingly, but because no one had ever known what had happened to her. As a child, he heard the story so often that her absence became part of the family's identity. He became an adult, carrying that unanswered question with him. Years earlier, around 2017, he had decided to take matters into his own hands. He ordered DNA kits from multiple genealogy companies, hoping the widest net would bring the greatest chance at a breakthrough. He told himself that maybe his aunt, or the child she was believed to have given birth to, had taken a test too, or that someone connected to them might. Even if it took months or years, he believed DNA could bring a reunion. When his results arrived, he matched only to a handful of distant relatives. Nothing closer, nothing promising, no sign of Evelyn, no sign of the baby she was said to have had. He kept searching anyway, checking the databases from time to time, hoping the years would eventually bring the connection he prayed for. By the time investigators called him in March of 2021, he had almost accepted that he would never know the truth. The voice on the phone changed everything. Detectives explained that the DNA of an unidentified murder victim from the 1970s had been run through a database, one of the same databases where he had uploaded his own results. The system had flagged him as a close familial match. Not distant, not questionable. Close. His heart sank. His mind raced. His family only had one missing person. He knew, even before the detectives confirmed it, that this unidentified woman, this Beth Doe, had to be his Aunt Evelyn. It was not the reunion he had hoped for. It was the answer his family feared most. The investigator spoke gently, but there was no way to soften the reality. Evelyn Colon, missing since mid-December of 1976, had not moved away. She had not started a new life. She had not written that letter from Connecticut of her own free will. She had died only hours after she was last seen alive, and her unborn daughter had died with her. Shock turned to grief, and grief turned to a painful understanding that everything the family had hoped for over the years, her happiness, her safety, the possibility she was living somewhere quietly, had been taken before it ever had a chance to exist. But grief was not the only thing carried by the DNA results, because with the victim's identity confirmed, investigators could finally follow the trail of the man who had been the last person to see her alive. His name was Luis Sierra. He had once been the Colon family's neighbor in Jersey City, New Jersey. Evelyn had begun seeing him when she was barely a teenager. His jealousy and temper were well known. He controlled her, isolated her, and according to Evelyn herself, sometimes locked her in their apartment. She had told her mother several times that if anything happened to her, he would be the reason. Shortly after Evelyn became pregnant at the age of 15, she moved into an apartment with Sierra. Though she tried to remain close with her family, the situation grew increasingly strained. In mid-December of 1976, she told her mother she wasn't feeling well. Her mother prepared soup and went to the apartment to check on her, but Evelyn wasn't there. Neighbors claimed the young couple had moved out suddenly. Her family searched frantically for days, then weeks. Then, early the following year, they received a letter. It stated that Evelyn had given birth to a 9-pound baby boy and that she was living in Connecticut. The envelope itself was postmarked from Connecticut, seemingly confirming her new location. The tone of the letter was calm, reassuring, almost scripted. She wrote that she would reach out if she ever needed anything. It was the last communication they ever received. Many news outlets would later report that the family didn't file a missing person report because of this letter. But the truth, as told by her brother and nephew, was very different. They did try to report her missing. Police declined because the letter suggested she had moved voluntarily. And so, the family waited. They waited through the 1970s, through the 1980s, through fires that destroyed family possessions, including every photograph they once had of Evelyn, through sleepless nights, through birthdays she never came home for, through holidays where a chair at the table remained empty, through decades of hope mixed with dread. Her mother died still looking out the window, watching the street below, hoping her daughter might appear one day. Her final words to her son were simple and devastating. Find Evelyn. The family mourned without answers for more than 40 years. And then, on the last day of March in the year 2021, the Pennsylvania State Police announced an arrest. 63-year-old Luis Sierra, now a married father of 2, living a quiet life in the Ozark Park neighborhood of Queens, New York, was taken into custody and charged with 1 count of criminal homicide. He was arraigned in Queens Criminal Court and held without bail while awaiting extradition to Pennsylvania. Neighbors reacted with disbelief. They described him as kind, as gentle, as someone who helped carry groceries, shoveled snow, and stopped to talk pleasantly with anyone. They said they could not imagine him harming anyone. They said he felt like family. But the truth had been buried for decades beneath layers of distance, time, and a life rebuilt far from the place where everything began. When investigators interviewed Sierra shortly before his arrest, he initially denied knowing Evelyn at all. Only when pressed further did he admit to having dated her and getting her pregnant. He claimed that when he returned home one day and found her missing, he assumed she had gone to her mother's house. He said he moved back in with his father shortly afterward. Eventually, he admitted something much more telling. He had written and mailed the letter. Evelyn's family received a letter sent well after the date investigators now knew she had been killed. But when asked to explain the timing, he had no answer. With Sierra in custody, Evelyn's family felt a mixture of sorrow, anger, and relief. They finally knew what had happened. They finally knew she had not abandoned them. They finally knew she had not built a new life, because her life had been taken from her before she even had a chance to hold her child. Her family chose to name her unborn daughter Emily Grace. They believed Evelyn had planned to name her Emily. The middle name Grace was chosen as a testament to the mercy they believed God had shown them by finally giving them answers. The timing mattered deeply to them. Evelyn's identity was confirmed just weeks before what would have been her 60th birthday, and just days before Easter, a holiday symbolizing resurrection and renewal. To her family, the timing felt almost spiritual. Her niece, Miriam, said it best. In light of the whole Easter season, with the Christ resurrection, her identity, her case, her life, the justice for her murder, is being truly resurrected from her grave. The Colon family, now spread across the country, immediately began making plans to travel to Carbon County to visit Evelyn and Emily's grave. Financial limitations and travel restrictions made it difficult, but they were determined. They started a fundraiser to help their scattered family come together, not only to honor Evelyn, but to meet the community that had cared for her all those years, to meet the strangers who had left flowers for her when her own family did not even know where she rested, to meet the county that had prayed for her. Carbon County had adopted her, and her family saw this as a beautiful, unexpected blessing. "You're all family now, too," Miriam said, expressing gratitude for the love shown to someone the community had never known in life. But even with Sierra behind bars, the case remained a heavy weight. Investigators continued searching for additional witnesses. They urged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. The Pennsylvania State Police and the Carbon County District Attorney's Office established a dedicated tip line with Crime Stoppers, hoping that buried memories might resurface now that the truth had begun to unfold. For Evelyn's brother, Luis Colon Sr., justice was not simply a legal process, it was a mission. "I want to look at his eyes and ask him why," he said of Sierra. "I'm not going to rest until I get justice for my sister." His son, Luis Colon Jr., the nephew whose submission of DNA had finally brought Evelyn home, felt the same. "We got her name back. That's important. But now, we need justice." Now, decades after a violent act carried out beneath the winter sky of the Lehigh River, the truth had finally clawed its way into the light. But this story is not just about the solving of a case. It is about a girl who vanished at 15, a baby who never took her first breath, a family torn apart by silence, a community that refused to forget, and a name, Evelyn, that was finally spoken again after being lost for nearly half a century. In the years that followed the discovery of the 3 black suitcases beneath the Interstate 80 bridge, the case of the unidentified woman known only as Beth Doe took on a life of its own. Though investigators pursued every lead available to them, each path eventually dissolved into the same cold silence. Yet even as the official investigation slowed, the story continued to live quietly in the corners of Carbon County. People spoke of her with a kind of solemn affection, as though she had always belonged to their community. Children grew up visiting her grave, placing flowers, wondering who she had been and whether someone, somewhere, still waited for news of her. Those long decades created 2 parallel worlds, one where a community cared deeply for a girl they had never met, and another where a family hundreds of miles away lay awake at night wondering what had become of their daughter and sister. They existed entirely unaware of one another, not knowing they were connected by a single moment of unthinkable violence on a cold December afternoon in 1976. For the Colons, the search for Evelyn lived in the background of their daily lives. They held on to hope longer than most would expect, clinging to the belief that she had perhaps needed space, or safety, or simply time to rebuild. They imagined she might call one day. They imagined she might return. They imagined she might appear with her child, explaining everything with the kind of story only life's cruelest twists can produce. But as the years stretched into decades, the absence grew heavier. Her siblings grew older. New children were born. Life moved forward, because it had to. Even so, Evelyn's mother continued to sit near the window many evenings, watching the people on the street below. She looked for familiar features in strangers, for a glimpse of her daughter's face in the flow of everyday life. And though no one told her then, Evelyn was already gone, buried beneath the earth of Carbon County, visited by strangers who felt connected to her because of the tragedy that had brought her there. The truth, hidden for more than 40 years, would eventually reveal itself not through eyewitness accounts or confessions or late-breaking forensic miracles, but through the decisions of a young man who had never met his aunt but loved her deeply. Luis Colon Jr. had grown up hearing stories about Evelyn, stories that had no definitive ending. His family spoke of her gently, often with pauses that carried the weight of grief even decades after her disappearance. As a boy, he imagined her somewhere far away, alive, possibly with a new family, perhaps unaware of the pain her absence had caused. When he grew older, the uncertainty became something he carried quietly, a thread woven into the background of his life. It was this sense of injustice, not knowing, not understanding, that pushed him to take the first DNA test. He researched multiple companies, ordered multiple kits, and mailed sample after sample, hoping the wide net might catch something others had missed. Every time new results became available, he checked with the kind of anticipation that can only be fueled by hope. But each time, the data offered nothing but distant cousins and strangers whose names meant nothing to him. Still, he kept trying. He imagined Evelyn somewhere out there, perhaps unaware her family was looking. He imagined her child, his cousin, possibly living a full life, maybe curious too, maybe searching. In a way, his search was an act of faith. Faith that the truth would eventually surface. Faith that the decades had not erased her completely. Faith that the story would not end in silence. And then, in the spring of 2021, a notification from a law enforcement database changed the course of the case forever. The investigators knew immediately that their match was significant. A close familial connection rarely appears by chance. They compared DNA markers, verified systems, ran cross-checks, and then prepared to make the call. On their end, the moment was electrifying, the kind of breakthrough cold case detectives wait entire careers to witness. For the Colon family, that call became a doorway to a truth they had feared for years but never fully accepted. They listened as detectives explained that the remains known for decades as Beth Doe had been identified. She was a young girl from Jersey City. She had been pregnant. She had disappeared in December of 1976. Her name was Evelyn. The confirmation shattered the fragile hope they had clung to. For years, they had believed they might one day see her smile again. Now, they understood that her final moments had been marked not by peace, but by terror. Her final hours were not spent building a future, but facing unimaginable violence. The grief that followed was heavy and raw. Even after 40 years, the pain felt immediate, a fresh wound carved into a story that had never truly healed. But within that pain was something else as well. Understanding, closure, the knowledge that Evelyn had not chosen to leave them, that she had not lived all those years somewhere else, content and distant. She had not abandoned them. Instead, she had been stolen from them. And perhaps most important of all, her name, her true name, was spoken aloud again. For the first time since 1976, she was no longer Beth Doe. She was Evelyn, a daughter, a sister, a niece, a young girl who mattered deeply to the people who had loved her. As investigators prepared to extradite Sierra from New York to Pennsylvania, they began reconstructing the timeline with far more precision than they had in the months following the discovery of the suitcases. They spoke with neighbors, former friends, and anyone who might have witnessed the young couple's movements in the final weeks of Evelyn's life. What they confirmed was chilling. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Evelyn had expressed fear about Sierra's behavior. His possessiveness had intensified. His jealousy had escalated. He was known to isolate her, to keep her inside the apartment for long periods. She confided in her mother that if something ever happened to her, Sierra would be responsible. That warning lingered painfully in her family's memory. Investigators also uncovered details suggesting the letter sent to her family early the next year had likely been written by Sierra in an attempt to mislead them, a move that delayed any search for her, a move that created the illusion of safety long after Evelyn had been killed. When questioned, Sierra admitted nothing that clarified the timeline. He gave vague statements, contradicting himself at times, denying involvement, then denying knowledge entirely. His shifting answers mirrored the behavior investigators often see in cases where guilt casts a long shadow. Even his neighbors in Queens, who only knew the man he became decades after the crime, were stunned. They described him as polite, quiet, always willing to help. But decades can change a person. The man he was at 19, the man who had been jealous, controlling, and violent, had long been buried beneath the layers of an ordinary life. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising. As Evelyn's family processed the news, they began speaking publicly, not only to honor her memory, but to shine a light on the details of her case that had been lost over the years. They spoke of her soft nature, her dreams, her smile. They described her as a sweetheart, a girl with a gentle heart and a closeness to her mother that made her disappearance all the more devastating. Her siblings shared memories of her laughter. Her niece and nephew, born after her death, spoke of the love they felt for an aunt they had never met, but had grown up hearing about in stories. Her family's pain became a reflection of all the years lost. But the community that had cared for her also reacted with profound emotion. For decades, Carbon County residents had visited the grave of a girl they never knew. In discovering her true identity, they felt a sense of connection reaffirmed, not broken. She had belonged to them all those years. Now, she belonged to her family again as well. This bridging of two worlds, the community who kept her memory alive and the family who never stopped searching, created something rare in the world of cold cases. A sense of collective mourning shared by strangers who had been unknowingly united for decades. For many, the revelation became a reminder that even the coldest stories are not truly frozen. Time does not erase truth. It waits for the moment when science, memory, and persistence meet. In the weeks that followed the identification of Evelyn Colon, the story spread quietly through newsrooms, online forums, genealogy groups, and families who had followed the case for years. People who had grown up hearing whispers of Beth Doe felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that she finally had a name. Sorrow that the truth behind that name was far more tragic than anyone had imagined. For many in Carbon County, the identity didn't change their commitment to her, it strengthened it. They had cared for her grave, prayed for her, and kept her memory alive for decades. Now, knowing who she truly was, they felt an even deeper connection to her story. Only now she was no longer a mystery they carried out of compassion. She was a real girl with a real family who had suffered in silence for more than 40 years. Her grave, once marked only by the temporary name Beth Doe, took on new meaning. Some community members spoke about raising funds to update the marker, to finally give Evelyn and her unborn daughter Emily Grace the dignity of being named properly. Others wrote messages online, expressing their joy that the young woman they had honored for so long finally had her identity restored. But for the Colon family, everything was much heavier. The revelation that Evelyn had been dead since 1976 rewrote the timeline of their grief. They had lived nearly half a century believing she was somewhere out there living, struggling, growing older, maybe raising her child. They imagined she might appear one day, offering explanations wrapped in tears and relief. They imagined the joyful chaos of returning to a family she had left behind. To learn that she had never lived beyond her 15th year was devastating. They mourned not only the daughter, sister, aunt, and niece they lost, but all the years she had been absent, not by her choice, but by violence. Her siblings reflected on who she might have become. They imagined her celebrating birthdays, holding her baby, perhaps raising a larger family, working somewhere she loved. They imagined her smiling through ordinary moments of adulthood, the kind of moments she never received the chance to experience. Her nephew, Luis, who had spent years searching for answers, described the pain of knowing that his DNA submission, meant to bring a joyful reunion, had instead confirmed a long-feared tragedy. He had hoped to meet Evelyn someday, even if that meant meeting her in old age, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Instead, he learned the truth of her death through the same system he had once believed would help bring her home safely. The weight of that realization stayed with him. He spoke openly about how he wished the truth had been different. He wished the DNA match had led to a living relative, not to the cold shadow of a decades-old crime. Yet, even through the sorrow, the family found solace in one undeniable truth. Evelyn had not disappeared willingly. She had not abandoned them. She had not chosen silence. Her absence had not been her doing. She had been taken. That understanding provided a sliver of peace, a recognition that they had been right to search for her, right to question the silence, right to hold on to hope. They had not been abandoned. They had been robbed. For investigators, Evelyn's identification provided the first solid foundation the case had ever had. They could now reconstruct her final days with more clarity, identifying who she spoke to, where she went, and how her life intertwined with the circumstances of her death. They confirmed that she had remained in close contact with her family until the very end. They uncovered details showing how quickly Sierra's behavior shifted from possessive to threatening. They learned about the day Evelyn told her mother she felt unwell, only for her mother to arrive at the apartment and find her missing. They learned how neighbors claimed the couple had moved out overnight, a detail that aligned disturbingly with the timeline of her murder. They also studied the letter, the carefully crafted message that had pacified the family long enough for the case to slip through the cracks. They examined the handwriting, the postmark, the timing. They compared it to statements Sierra made during interviews, and they found inconsistencies everywhere. The letter spoke of a healthy baby boy, 9 pounds, happy and safe. But Evelyn had died before ever giving birth. Her unborn daughter, Emily Grace, died with her. The letter spoke of new apartments, new beginnings, and plans to reconnect. But the postmark suggested it had been mailed long after her death. The letter spoke of hope. But the truth behind it was deception. For Evelyn's family, the letter had once been a fragile lifeline, a reassurance that she was alive somewhere. For investigators, it became evidence that someone had tried to rewrite her final chapter. In the days after Sierra's arrest, reporters reached out to his neighbors in Queens. Many were shocked. They described him as a man who helped shovel snow, who held the door for others, who offered quiet greetings in the hallways. Some said he felt like an uncle, that he was gentle with children, that they never imagined him capable of harming anyone. But Sierra's outward behavior in adulthood could not erase the reality of who he had been decades earlier. Investigators knew that people can build entirely new lives around old secrets. They knew that the passage of time often softens a person's outward image, even when the truth remains buried beneath years of silence. Behind the polite smiles and neighborly gestures was a history of violence, one that culminated in the taking of a young girl's life and the life of her unborn child. As the legal process moved forward, Sierra appeared in court looking far different from the 19-year-old who once lived with Evelyn in Jersey City. His hair had thinned, his face had aged. His demeanor was quiet, almost reserved. But the charges against him carried a weight that transcended the decades between the crime and his arrest. For Evelyn's family, seeing him in custody brought both relief and anger. Relief that he would finally face the consequences of what he had done. Anger that he had lived more than 40 years of freedom, building a life, raising children, growing older while Evelyn's life had ended before it even truly began. Her brother Luis spoke with fierce determination. "I want to look at his eyes and ask him why," he said. "I want him to tell me what he did. I want justice for my sister." His words echoed the sentiment of the entire family. They had waited long enough. They had lived with the weight of uncertainty for too many years. Now, with the truth finally exposed, they were ready to fight for justice, not just for Evelyn, but for Emily Grace as well. Yet even with Sierra in custody, investigators made it clear that the case was still active. They sought additional witnesses, anyone who knew the couple in 1976, anyone who might remember unusual behavior, conversations, or sightings from that period. Memory fades, but guilt leaves impressions. They hoped that time might have softened some fears, allowing long-silenced voices to finally come forward. The Pennsylvania State Police established a dedicated tip line in partnership with Crime Stoppers, inviting the public to share any information they had, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Sometimes the smallest memory becomes the key that unlocks long-hidden truths. For the Colon family, the pursuit of justice became a new chapter in their long journey. They were no longer searching for Evelyn. They had found her. Now they were fighting for her. Even across decades, even across states, even across generations, the echoes of her story remained powerful. Her name once lost was now spoken everywhere. Her memory once silent was now carried by thousands. And her story once trapped beneath the weight of anonymity was now unfolding with the full force of truth behind it. In the quiet corners of Carbon County, the news of Evelyn Colon's identification stirred emotions that rippled through neighborhoods, workplaces, and homes. People who had grown up hearing only the name Beth Doe now found themselves whispering a new name, Evelyn. It felt personal. It felt sacred. It felt like closing a chapter that had been left open far too long. Local residents who had visited her grave for years now understood who they had been honoring. They posted messages online describing how surreal it felt to finally know her identity. For many, the revelation brought a sense of relief, a feeling that the years they spent caring for her resting place had not been in vain. They had not been tending to a stranger. They had been tending to Evelyn. There were stories of older residents who remembered placing flowers on her grave in the 80s. They recalled visiting during holidays, lighting candles, saying silent prayers. Parents spoke of taking their children to the grave, telling them about a young woman who deserved to be remembered. These shared acts of kindness built a bond that had lasted decades. Now, knowing her real name, many felt as though they had been given a chance to finally grieve the girl they had unknowingly adopted as their own. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the Colon family faced a grief far deeper, the grief of learning the truth after decades of painful uncertainty. Knowing where Evelyn had been all along filled them with a heartbreaking mixture of sorrow and comfort. They finally knew where she rested, but they also knew how violently her life had been taken. Her sisters described Evelyn as soft-spoken, affectionate, and loyal. They spoke about her love for her family, her closeness to her mother, and her dreams of motherhood. They remembered her as someone who loved helping others, someone who adored spending time with her younger siblings, someone who had her whole future ahead of her. To imagine her final moments, filled with fear, violence, and betrayal, was almost unbearable. Yet through the sorrow, her family experienced an unexpected sense of closeness to the community that had protected Evelyn's memory all those years. They felt grateful to strangers who had cared enough to honor her, even though they had never known her. They felt comforted by the idea that Evelyn had not been alone in death, that she had not been forgotten, that her grave had never been left untouched or unloved. In interviews, Evelyn's niece, Miriam, spoke with a powerful blend of gratitude and emotion. She said that the timing of Evelyn's identification felt meaningful, almost divine. Her identity had been restored near Easter, a season of resurrection. It was as if her story had risen from the shadows just when her family needed it most. They prayed for her, she said of Carbon County. They cared for her when we didn't even know where she was. They kept her memory alive. That means everything. Her family vowed to visit her grave, even if it meant crossing states, adjusting schedules, or raising funds. They wanted to stand beside the headstone that had carried the wrong name for so long. They wanted to bring flowers not as strangers, but as family. They wanted to give Evelyn and Emily Grace the kind of acknowledgement that had been delayed for almost half a century. As preparations for Sierra's extradition moved forward, investigators continued assembling every available piece of evidence. They revisited witness statements from the 1970s, combed through archived records, and reviewed physical evidence collected throughout the decades. They compiled a detailed account of Evelyn's final days, supported by modern forensic science and the renewed interest that followed her identification. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the fact that Evelyn had confided in her mother about Sierra's behavior. She had warned her that if anything happened, he would be involved. Those words stayed with her family, replaying in their minds now with devastating clarity. Investigators uncovered testimonies confirming that Sierra had been controlling and aggressive during the relationship. He dictated who Evelyn could see, where she could go, and how she spent her time. His jealousy was intense, his temper unpredictable. In retrospect, these were early signs of the danger that would ultimately take her life. The timeline became clearer as the pieces fell into place. Evelyn had spoken with her mother in mid-December, explaining that she felt unwell. Her mother, concerned, went to bring her soup. When she arrived at the apartment Evelyn shared with Sierra, she found it empty. Neighbors said the couple had moved out earlier, but investigators later determined that this was not true. It was a story crafted to conceal what had happened. Within 24 hours of that conversation, Evelyn had been murdered. Within days of her disappearance, Sierra had reappeared in Jersey City, living once again with his father, claiming Evelyn had left. Weeks later, the letter arrived, a carefully orchestrated piece of deception designed to keep the family from searching further. The more investigators learned, the clearer the narrative became. Her death had been an act of violence rooted in control, not a disappearance rooted in choice. But even with the truth emerging, the emotional toll on her family was profound. They had lived through decades of doubt, regret, and unanswered questions. Now, with the truth exposed, they faced the painful task of reconstructing their memories through a lens they had never expected, the lens of understanding just how much Evelyn had endured. Her siblings described moments from their childhood differently now. They remembered small instances where she seemed sad or distant. They thought back to comments she made about Sierra, things they had overlooked or dismissed as typical teenage relationship struggles. They remembered the worry in her mother's eyes the day she received the letter. Every detail felt heavier in hindsight. Yet even through their grief, they maintained their focus on justice. Evelyn's brother Luis expressed a fierce determination, saying he wanted to confront Sierra face to face. He wanted answers. He wanted the full truth about what his sister had endured. He wanted closure for the years of pain and silence his family had experienced. His son, Luis Jr., echoed the sentiment. Though burdened by the reality that his DNA had revealed a tragedy and not a reunion, he remained committed to seeing the legal process through. "We got her name," he said. "That's important. But now we need justice. We need the full story of what happened to her. We need accountability." The Colon family prepared to follow the case through each legal step, from extradition to hearings, from motions to trial. They were ready to fight for Evelyn and Emily Grace, ensuring that the truth of their deaths would not fade into obscurity. Meanwhile, investigators hoped that Evelyn's identification might inspire others from that era to come forward with information. Memories from the 1970s might be fragmented, but even the faintest recollection could reveal new details. Someone might remember a conversation Sierra had years ago. Someone might recall seeing the couple on or near the time of Evelyn's disappearance. Someone might have witnessed something strange near the bridge or heard something whispered in passing. Time often brings new clarity even to old, forgotten memories. As the case moved forward, Evelyn's story gained increasing attention across the country. True crime communities online revisited the case, sharing updated information, piecing together timelines, and expressing their shock at the brutality of her death. Many were moved by the idea that she had been known only as Beth Doe for decades, a name that symbolized the tragedy of the unidentified. Now, for the first time, the world spoke her real name, and in speaking it, they restored her humanity. Evelyn was no longer a cold case number. She was no longer a Jane Doe buried under a borrowed name. She was a loved daughter, a cherished sister, a young mother-to-be, a girl whose life had been stolen before she ever had the chance to hold her child. And as her story spread, something remarkable happened. People began sharing messages of love and support for the Colon family. Strangers from across the country reached out, posting condolences, prayers, and words of encouragement. Some shared similar stories of loss. Others expressed outrage that the case had remained unsolved for so long. A few even visited the cemetery, leaving flowers beside the grave that had held Evelyn for more than 40 years without her family's knowledge. Her story, once buried in anonymity, had risen to touch countless lives. As the truth of Evelyn Colon's story spread across state lines and digital spaces, the emotional weight of her case deepened for everyone who learned about it. For people in Carbon County, she had always been a quiet presence, a solemn reminder of a life cut short. For genealogists and true crime followers, she had been one of the most haunting and heartbreaking unidentified victims in American history. And for her family, she had been an irreplaceable daughter and sister whose absence had shaped decades of their lives. Now that her identity had been restored, every detail of her story felt sharper, more human, more real. Investigators began re-examining every piece of evidence collected over the decades. They revisited the condition of the suitcases, the black spray paint, the damage from their fall, the way they had split open upon impact. They reviewed the newspaper pages found inside the late September Northern New Jersey edition. They re-evaluated the piece of chenille fabric that might have come from a robe or blanket. These items, once small threads in an overwhelming mystery, now carried new significance. They were no longer clues pointing to an anonymous victim, they were pieces of Evelyn's final hours. Investigators also revisited the autopsy details, reassessing them with modern forensic understanding. The brutality of her injuries painted a picture not of chaotic violence, but of violence carried out with intention. The strangulation, the single gunshot wound to the neck, the dismemberment, the removal of her unborn daughter. These were not spontaneous acts. They were methodical, deliberate, and deeply personal. Forensic experts explained that dismemberment often indicates an attempt to conceal identity, an attempt to prevent investigators from linking the victim to the killer. In Evelyn's case, that seemed painfully clear. She had been a young girl who knew her killer intimately, someone who feared losing control over her, someone who believed that removing her identity would also remove accountability. But identity, even when buried, has a way of enduring. It waits for truth to catch up. The re-examination of the crime scene also allowed investigators to better understand the logistics of the act. The location beneath Interstate 80 was not a random spot. It was remote, yet accessible. The river below, fast-moving in winter, would have carried the suitcases far, perhaps even out of state. But the killer had miscalculated the angle. Instead of landing in the water, the suitcases hit the rocky bank, splitting open and exposing what was inside. This small miscalculation shattered his plan and ultimately preserved the truth. If the suitcases had reached the river, Evelyn might never have been found. Her identity might have remained lost forever. Her family might still be waiting today. But fate, gravity, and a misjudged throw brought the truth to the riverbank that December afternoon. As modern investigators pieced together these details, they began constructing a fuller understanding of the killer's mindset. Sierra had been 19 at the time, young, but not so young that his actions could be dismissed as impulsive. His relationship with Evelyn had been defined by control. His jealousy had isolated her. His temper had frightened her, and according to Evelyn's own warnings to her mother, she feared that he might harm her. Control, fear, possession. These were the elements that shaped the final days of Evelyn's life. Despite the brutality of the crime, Sierra's life had moved forward uninterrupted. He had married, he had raised children, he had worked, lived, traveled, and enjoyed the ordinary privileges of adulthood. His past, buried beneath the layers of time, had allowed him to appear harmless to the people around him. Neighbors in Queens described him as warm, helpful, even gentle. His children had grown up without any knowledge of the crime committed before they were born. But the truth does not disappear. It only sleeps until reawakened by evidence. And in this case, it was awakened by DNA, a tool that had not existed in 1976, a scientific breakthrough that had become a bridge between past and present. Investigators credited the Colon family for their persistence. Their willingness to share DNA gave the case the final piece it needed. If Luis Colon Jr. had not uploaded his genetic profile to multiple databases, the match might never have occurred. If he had not searched, if he had not hoped, Evelyn might still be buried beneath the wrong name. This revelation hit him with a powerful combination of pride and pain. His actions had led to the truth, but the truth was devastating. He spoke openly about how he had hoped his DNA submission would bring a reunion, not a loss. But he also expressed gratitude that his aunt's story was no longer lost to time. In the aftermath of the identification, media outlets revisited the case with new depth. They explored Evelyn's childhood, her family dynamics, the circumstances that led her into a relationship with Sierra. They examined how a 15-year-old girl, pregnant and vulnerable, could have been so easily erased from the world. They questioned how a crime of such magnitude could go unpunished for decades. Many pointed to the systems in place during the 1970s, systems far less equipped to handle missing person cases, especially cases involving young girls who moved out with boyfriends or partners. The letter sent to her family, written in Evelyn's name but crafted by her killer, had convinced authorities at the time that she had left willingly. Without photographs to compare to sketches or reconstructions, especially after a house fire destroyed the family's albums, officials lacked the information needed to connect Evelyn to any unidentified remains. She did not fit into the databases of the time. She did not have modern identifiers. She simply vanished. Her family, robbed of the chance to report her missing, had been trapped in a painful limbo for years. Now, with Evelyn's identity restored, true crime scholars began discussing the case as a powerful example of how vital genealogical DNA has become in solving cold cases. Evelyn became one of the many unnamed victims brought home through the combination of science, persistence, and the love of families who refused to stop searching. But the case was not only about the science. It was also about the human connections built through decades of uncertainty. When Carbon County residents learned Evelyn's true identity, some visited her grave again, this time to speak her real name aloud. Others wrote to the Colon family online, describing how they had prayed for Evelyn and her unborn child for years. One woman wrote that she had visited the grave every Christmas to place flowers, believing that no one should rest alone during the holidays. Messages like these brought Evelyn's family to tears. They had spent decades longing for her, unaware that a small Pennsylvania town had been caring for her all along. Her brother Louis said, "Carbon County adopted her. It is incredible how you loved someone you didn't even know. We're thankful for all of you. You are family now, too." These words captured the heart of Evelyn's story, a story that had moved beyond the boundaries of crime and investigation into the realms of community, compassion, faith, and resilience. The Colons vowed to visit Carbon County as soon as they could. They started a fundraising effort to help scattered family members travel to the cemetery and honor Evelyn and Emily Grace. Travel restrictions from the global conditions at the time made it difficult, but their determination was unwavering. They planned not just to visit, but to thank the community in person, to stand where Evelyn had lain for decades, to reclaim her as family, to finally say goodbye. As Evelyn's story spread, the emotional impact reached far beyond Carbon County and Jersey City. People across the country began reflecting on the fragility of justice, how easily a life can disappear, how quickly a case can grow cold, and how extraordinary it is when the truth finally breaks through decades of silence. Evelyn was no longer just a case file, no longer just a reconstruction sketch or a nameless headstone. She had become a symbol of perseverance, proof that even after 40 years, the truth can find its way home. In the days following Sierra's arrest, investigators worked tirelessly to compile the full case file for extradition. They gathered witness statements from the 1970s, forensic reports from multiple decades, autopsy findings, and the results of the genealogical DNA analysis that led to the breakthrough. Every detail mattered. Every scrap of evidence, every forensic note, every archived photograph contributed to a final, cohesive timeline of Evelyn's last days. As detectives built their case, they examined one of the most haunting details: the physical distance between Jersey City, where Evelyn lived, and Carbon County, where her remains were found. It was more than 80 miles apart. This wasn't a crime of panic. It wasn't an impulsive act committed in the moment. It was deliberate, intentional, calculated. The drive from Jersey City to the riverbank beneath Interstate 80 would have taken hours, hours in which Evelyn was already gone, hours in which Sierra carried out the grim task of disposing of her remains, hours in which he would have had time to reconsider his actions, to turn back, to confess, to save whatever small piece of truth remained. But he didn't. Instead, he drove those miles with 3 suitcases containing the young girl he once claimed to love, a girl who had trusted him, lived with him, and carried his child. Investigators believed he chose a location far enough from their home that the remains might never be connected to him, a place where the rushing winter river might carry the evidence downstream, a place isolated enough that even if the suitcases were found, their contents might remain unidentified. But his plan faltered. Gravity, terrain, timing. 3 elements that he hadn't accounted for. The suitcases struck the ground instead of the river, splitting open on impact. That single miscalculation preserved Evelyn's chance at justice, even if it took more than 40 years for the truth to surface. When detectives reviewed the original 1976 reports, they saw how investigators back then had worked tirelessly with the information available to them. They had photographed every inch of the scene, documented every detail meticulously, and followed every known lead. But without DNA, without an identity, and without a missing person report matching Evelyn's description, the case grew colder each passing year. Not because the investigators lacked determination, but because they lacked the tools that would only come decades later. The dismemberment, the missing facial features, the lack of identifying objects, all these were signs of a killer who wanted her identity erased. Yet even through this brutality, Evelyn's identity endured. It waited in her bones, in her DNA, in the future generations who would one day carry technology capable of unlocking truths the 1970s could never have reached. For forensic genealogists, Evelyn's case became a powerful example of the value of DNA databases. It illustrated the ways in which ordinary citizens, through their own curiosity about heritage and ancestry, could unknowingly become the key to reopening cold cases once believed unsolvable. Many experts describe the moment Evelyn's identity was confirmed as a milestone, a testament to how science can restore the dignity of victims who have been nameless for too long. While investigators continued preparing the case for court, the Colon family spent long nights talking about Evelyn, not just about her death, but about her life. They shared memories that had been stored away for decades. They recalled her laughter, her shyness, her dreams. They described her as a girl who loved to be near her mother, who helped around the house, who smiled with a kind of innocence that made her disappearance feel all the more cruel. Her sister spoke of how Evelyn's pregnancy had brought both excitement and worry to the family. She had been so young, barely more than a child herself, yet she carried the hope of motherhood with her. They remembered how she talked about names for her unborn child. Some recalled her mentioning the name Emily, a name they chose to honor when renaming her daughter Emily Grace. It was a name filled with meaning. Emily, a reflection of the name Evelyn once considered. Grace, a reflection of the spiritual strength they believed carried them through the years. Emily Grace became the name given to a child who never took her first breath, whose life began and ended in the same moment, whose entire existence existed within her mother's womb. Even in death, Evelyn's baby was not forgotten. She was remembered, honored, and loved just as much a part of the family now as she would have been if she had lived. As the Colon family shared their memories publicly, people who had never met Evelyn felt drawn to her story. They felt the injustice deeply, aware that she had been only 15, an age where life should be blossoming, not ending. Her story sparked conversations about domestic violence, the vulnerabilities of young relationships, and the dangers faced by young girls who become isolated from their families. Advocates began discussing Evelyn's case in the context of broader issues: how easily controlling partners can manipulate teenagers, how family concerns sometimes go unacknowledged by authorities, and how vulnerable young girls can become targets of violence in situations where power imbalances go unnoticed. But Evelyn's story also sparked conversations about hope, the hope of advanced forensic science, the hope of community vigilance, the hope that long cold cases might finally be solved, even decades later. She became a symbol not only of tragedy, but of perseverance and truth. In Carbon County, whispers of Evelyn's story grew into discussions about updating her grave marker. People wrote to newspapers and posted online, asking whether a new headstone could be created, one that bore her real name and her daughter's name. Some offered donations, some offered to help design the marker. Some simply expressed their desire to see the name Beth Doe retired forever. For decades, that name had served as a placeholder, a symbol for the unknown. Now, with the truth revealed, it was time to give Evelyn her rightful place in history. Her identity had been hidden for so long that reclaiming her name felt almost sacred. Meanwhile, the court prepared for Sierra's extradition. Legal documents were filed. Hearings were scheduled. Reporters monitored the case. Neighbors in Queens continued expressing disbelief, while residents in Carbon County expressed relief that justice might finally be within reach. For Evelyn's family, the upcoming legal process represented more than a trial. It represented the final leg of a journey that had started the day she disappeared. A journey filled with unanswered questions, sleepless nights, painful uncertainty, and hope that never fully faded. They prepared to face Sierra in court, to stand in the same room as the man who had stolen Evelyn from them. Her brother, Luis, wise with age, yet still carrying the pain of a teenage boy who lost his sister, spoke about wanting to look Sierra in the eyes. He wanted to understand why. He wanted to confront the man who had taken so much from their family. His son, whose DNA submission brought the truth into the light, supported him fully. Though burdened by the emotional weight of what his search revealed, he was determined to stand firm for Evelyn and Emily Grace. The Colon family knew that the road ahead would be long. The justice system, especially in cases involving decades-old crimes, often moves slowly. But they were prepared. They had waited 40 years for answers. They could wait a little longer for justice. Through all of this, Evelyn's story continued touching lives around the world. People shared it, discussed it, researched it. They lit candles, sent messages, and created memorial posts. Each act, however small, contributed to the restoration of a girl who had been forgotten by the system, but remembered by strangers. Her life, once erased, was being pieced back together, not through fiction or embellishment, but through truth, compassion, and the voices of those determined to honor her. In the months following Evelyn's identification, the Colon family found themselves navigating a complicated landscape of grief, relief, and determination. They had answers now, but answers carried their own kind of weight. Every detail of Evelyn's final days, every discovery made in the investigation, every truth uncovered about Sierra's actions, reopened wounds that had been present for decades. Her siblings often spoke about how difficult it was to imagine Evelyn's last moments. They pictured her frightened, alone, and unable to protect herself or her unborn child. These thoughts were crushing. Yet they also found comfort in knowing that her story would no longer be defined by the anonymity she was buried under for so long. The world finally knew her name. As plans to bring the family to Carbon County moved forward, community members reached out through messages, emails, and social platforms, offering words of comfort. Many of them had never met the Colons, but they felt connected through the shared presence of Evelyn's grave. A grave they had visited, tended, and watched over like guardians of a memory they didn't even know belonged to a girl with a family who once lived hours away. Some residents recalled lighting candles for her every year on December 20th, the day she was found. Others remembered how the gravesite often filled with fresh flowers, sometimes from anonymous visitors, sometimes from families who lived nearby, sometimes from individuals who simply felt compelled to acknowledge her life. One woman described placing a small angel figurine on the grave every Easter, believing the symbol represented new beginnings and protection for the baby buried with her. These acts of kindness, though small, carried enormous meaning when Evelyn's family learned of them. They felt as though strangers had embraced Evelyn in their absence, ensuring she would never be forgotten. Her name may not have been known, but her memory, the essence of her existence, had been tended to with compassion. And for a family who had spent more than 40 years not knowing where she was or whether anyone had cared for her, these stories were both comforting and heartbreaking. They wished they had known sooner. They wished they had been able to stand at her grave all those years. They wished they had not spent decades searching, hoping, doubting, and wondering. But even through the sorrow, they expressed deep gratitude. Her mother, who had passed away years before the truth was uncovered, had lived every day hoping for Evelyn's return. She never gave up on her daughter. She never stopped watching the street, dreaming that the girl who disappeared at 15 might one day come home. Although she never received the answers she longed for, her family believed that the truth came at a spiritually meaningful time. Her son Luis remembered her final words, "Find Evelyn." And now, in a way they could never have predicted, they had fulfilled her last request. The Colon family believed their mother would have been grateful to know that the community of Carbon County had protected her daughter's memory, that they had prayed for Evelyn and Emily Grace, that they had kept the grave from falling into neglect. Through grief, the family found connection. Through tragedy, they found community. And through DNA, they found truth. As investigators continued preparing for Sierra's extradition, more details about the original investigation resurfaced. Reporters revisiting the 1976 case files discovered that law enforcement had poured an extraordinary amount of effort into identifying Beth Doe. They had created multiple composite sketches. They had analyzed the spray paint on the suitcases. They had attempted to trace the origin of the newspaper pages used as packing. They had even studied the rope, tape, and materials used in the dismemberment. But without an identity, the investigation had been stuck at a dead end. At the time, the concept of a nationwide database for missing persons was still in its infancy. The technology for DNA identification did not exist. Communication between states was slow, often fragmented. And Evelyn's family had been effectively blocked from filing a missing person report because of the letter written in her name. Without that report, Evelyn's case never entered the national system. She became lost not because investigators lacked skill, but because the tools and communication standards of the era were limited. Her body remained unidentified because the systems meant to protect her had not yet evolved. In a cruel twist, the same letter meant to deceive her family had also prevented authorities from connecting her to Beth Doe. It had been a single piece of calculated manipulation that suspended Evelyn's story for 4 decades, a single lie that shaped the course of an entire family's search. As true crime analysts studied the case, they reflected on the ways in which young victims, especially teenagers in vulnerable relationships, are often overlooked by systems that rely heavily on parental reports. Evelyn was 15, caught between childhood and adulthood. Her attempts to maintain independence may have made it easier for authorities to believe she had simply left on her own. The fear expressed to her mother had not been recorded officially, and in the 1970s, domestic violence among teenage couples was rarely treated with the seriousness it receives today. In this way, Evelyn's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily the voices of young girls can be dismissed and how dangerous that dismissal can become. Advocates for missing and exploited children began referencing Evelyn's case in discussions about improving protocols for minors who leave home under uncertain circumstances. They highlighted the importance of detailed reporting, the need for photographs to be preserved, and the ways in which family concerns should always be taken seriously. Her story became more than a cold case. It became part of a broader conversation. Meanwhile, true crime enthusiasts continued forming online groups dedicated to honoring Evelyn and Emily Grace. Some created digital memorial artwork. Others pieced together timelines. Some produced documentaries or narrated videos detailing the history of the case and its resolution. For the Colon family, seeing Evelyn's story reach so many people brought a mixture of heartbreak and gratitude. They were grateful that Evelyn was finally being acknowledged, finally being spoken about with her real name, finally being recognized as someone who lived, loved, and was deeply loved in return. But they were heartbroken that it took more than 40 years for that recognition to come. Still, they viewed every message, every prayer, every expression of sympathy as a tribute to the girl they lost. In sharing her story, people were helping to keep Evelyn's memory alive, not as Beth Doe, but as the daughter and sister she had always been. As the date of Sierra's next court appearance approached, investigators began receiving more calls, more tips, more small fragments of information from people who remembered snippets of the past. Some callers mentioned recalling the couple arguing. Some mentioned seeing Evelyn in the weeks before her disappearance. Others remembered Sierra's behavior around the time she vanished. The puzzle pieces that had once been spread across decades were now being slowly gathered and placed into a more complete picture. One detective described the experience like watching fog lift from a long shadowed landscape. For the first time, the path toward justice was visible. Evelyn's story, once frozen in time, was now moving again. Her name, once silenced, was now spoken everywhere. Justice, once impossibly distant, was now within reach. As Sierra's extradition approached, Evelyn's case entered a new phase 1, where the legal system would take center stage. For her family, this meant navigating hearings, statements, and the slow, often frustrating process of courtroom proceedings. But it also meant something more profound: the possibility of finally hearing the truth spoken aloud, in front of a judge, in front of the community, in front of the world. They knew that legal justice can be unpredictable. Decades-old cases come with challenges. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. Witnesses disappear. But they were committed to seeing the process through, no matter how long it took or how difficult it became. They owed Evelyn and Emily Grace that much. Behind the scenes, the Carbon County District Attorney's Office worked closely with the Pennsylvania State Police to ensure that no detail was overlooked. Every part of the original investigation was re-examined. The suitcases, the materials used to conceal the remains, the autopsy records, and the physical items found at the scene, all of it was included in the growing case file. One piece of evidence stood out for its chilling intimacy: the letter. Typed, mailed, and postmarked from Connecticut, the letter had been carefully crafted to mimic Evelyn's voice. It referenced a healthy baby boy. It described a new life and a new home. It reassured her family that she would be in touch again soon. At the time, it had been enough to stop police from filing a missing person report. But with the benefit of hindsight and forensic analysis, it was now seen for what it truly was: a cruel deception, a deliberate attempt to silence a family's concern, and a final act of control from a man who had already taken 2 lives. When investigators confronted Sierra with the timeline of events, he admitted to writing the letter. He said it had been mailed after he and Evelyn had visited Connecticut to look at apartments. But he could not explain why the letter was sent after Evelyn's death, or why the details in the letter contradicted what investigators knew to be true. The inconsistencies in his statements were glaring. His vague answers only strengthened the case against him. As preparations for trial continued, the Colon family remained vocal about their desire for justice. They were not interested in revenge. What they wanted was truth. They wanted Sierra to admit what he had done. They wanted the world to know how hard Evelyn had fought to survive. They wanted recognition for the baby who had never been born. They wanted the court to acknowledge that Evelyn and Emily Grace had mattered. They wanted to reclaim the narrative, to shift it away from the brutality of their deaths and toward the resilience of their memory. In the months that followed Evelyn's identification, journalists, documentary producers, and podcast creators began covering her case. But unlike many true crime stories, this one was not driven by speculation or sensationalism. It was driven by facts, by science, by the determination of a family who refused to let her disappear. In many ways, Evelyn's story challenged the conventions of typical cold case coverage. She was not a young adult who vanished during a trip. She was not a known runaway. She was not the subject of tabloid mystery. She was a 15-year-old girl who had simply slipped through the cracks, a girl whose case lacked the headlines and urgency often afforded to others. But in being found, her case began to correct that silence. She became a reminder that even the most overlooked stories deserve resolution. She became a reminder that even unnamed victims are loved by someone, somewhere. She became a reminder that time does not erase truth, it only delays it. For the Colon family, those reminders mattered deeply. They had spent too long wondering whether Evelyn had chosen to leave, whether she was safe, whether she had been angry, scared, desperate, whether they had failed her. In discovering the truth, they released themselves from those questions. They now understood that Evelyn's disappearance had never been about abandonment. It had always been about violence. They allowed themselves, finally, to grieve openly, to speak of her in the present tense, to share their memories without the pain of uncertainty clouding every word. And they began to plan something beautiful. With help from community donations and support from Carbon County residents, the family began designing a new headstone for Evelyn and Emily Grace. It would no longer read Beth Doe. It would carry her true name, her birth year, and the date her body was found. It would include Emily's name, with a tender inscription chosen by her family, something that honored both lives, no matter how short one of them had been. The redesign of the grave marker became a symbol of restoration, a symbolic undoing of the anonymity that had defined her for too long. The ceremony to install the new headstone was planned as a small, private affair, just family, a few close community members, and the local pastor who had presided over the original burial. But even in its intimacy, the ceremony carried profound meaning. For the first time, Evelyn and Emily would be acknowledged by name, surrounded by people who had never stopped searching and people who had never stopped caring. On the day of the installation, Evelyn's brother Luis stood quietly at the grave. He looked at the new marker, ran his hand along the engraved names, and said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he whispered, "You're home now." Her sisters placed flowers, white lilies for Evelyn, and tiny pink roses for Emily Grace. Her niece Miriam stood back, watching her family mourn the girl they had lost and honor the child they never met. The pastor spoke softly about healing, about restoration, about the power of truth to bring peace. The prayer was brief, but the silence that followed was long and full of emotion. For the Colon family, that moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where Evelyn's story would no longer be defined by mystery, but by memory. They knew there was still a long legal road ahead, but they also knew they had reclaimed something that had once seemed lost forever. A name, a daughter, a sister, A legacy. In the weeks following the installation of the new headstone, something shifted within the Colon family, a quiet but powerful sense of reclamation. For decades, they had lived with uncertainty, imagining countless possibilities for Evelyn's fate. Now, finally, the truth was known. Her memory had been honored. Her daughter had been named. And for the first time since 1976, the family felt a measure of peace settle around the wound that had never fully healed. But even as they cherished this moment, they knew the journey wasn't over. The legal fight was only beginning. Back in Carbon County, prosecutors continued strengthening the case against Sierra. They reviewed every detail from Evelyn's last known movements to Sierra's inconsistent statements, from the forensic evidence to the emotional impact on the family. They examined the letter again and again, using forensic linguists and handwriting specialists to analyze it. They built psychological profiles. They interviewed experts in domestic violence who shed light on the patterns of coercive control that often escalate into lethal violence. In these discussions, Evelyn's story became more than a crime. It became a case study in the danger that arises when a vulnerable girl becomes isolated from her support system. Advocates emphasized that her warnings, the ones she gave her mother, should never have been dismissed. They highlighted how easily teenagers can become trapped in abusive situations, and how the lack of resources in the 1970s allowed such cases to be overlooked. As these conversations unfolded, Evelyn's legacy grew. Her story began inspiring important discussions in schools, youth groups, and domestic violence prevention programs. Her name became a reminder of why it is crucial to take the concerns of young women seriously, especially those navigating the complexities of early relationships. Meanwhile, investigators continued conducting interviews. People from Evelyn's old neighborhood in Jersey City shared memories they had held onto for decades, fragments of conversations, moments of tension between Evelyn and Sierra, signs that something had not been right in those final weeks. Many said they wished they had said something sooner. They wished they had recognized the warning signs. They wished they had been able to help her. But guilt was not the point of their stories. Every memory, every detail, every observation became part of a larger effort to bring Evelyn justice. The extradition process moved forward. Sierra was eventually transferred from New York to Pennsylvania, where he was held without bail. His arraignment was brief. He spoke little, answering standard questions, offering no statement about the charges. His demeanor was calm, but investigators saw something deeper behind the stillness, the weight of decades-old secrets resurfacing through the undeniable clarity of DNA. For the Colon family, seeing him in court for the first time was surreal. He looked older, weaker, and smaller than they remembered, but age did not diminish the impact of his actions. In their eyes, he was still the 19-year-old who took Evelyn's life, robbed their family of answers, and attempted to erase all traces of her existence. Luis, Evelyn's brother, felt a storm of emotions as he watched Sierra speak to the judge. He had waited decades for this moment. He had prepared himself for the possibility that Sierra might remain silent, that he might show no remorse. And though the courtroom was structured and controlled, the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. His niece, Miriam, described the scene as a collision of past and present. They stood in the same room as the man who had shaped their entire family's life through a single act of violence. Seeing him face legal consequences brought both relief and anger. Relief that justice was finally underway. Anger that it had taken so long. Reporters covering the case noted the quiet dignity of the Colon family. They did not lash out. They did not shout. They did not seek attention. They simply stood as a united force, determined to honor Evelyn through truth and perseverance. As the pre-trial process continued, the community in Carbon County followed the case closely. Many residents still visited Evelyn's grave. Some left cards written in careful cursive, addressing her by name. Others wrote messages for Emily Grace, messages that acknowledged her tiny, silent presence in the world. Still others left flowers, candles, and small, thoughtful tokens. One note read, "You are loved by more people than you ever knew." Another read, "Rest, Evelyn. We know who you are now." Meanwhile, the Colon family began organizing a private memorial service. They wanted to gather at Evelyn and Emily Grace's grave once more, this time with the full knowledge of their identities, their stories, and the truth behind their lives. They planned to bring photographs, poems, and songs that once reminded them of Evelyn. They wanted to create a moment of closure, a moment that belonged to Evelyn, not to the case, not to the investigation, not to the tragedy, but to the girl who had loved her family deeply and had been loved just as deeply in return. In planning the memorial, the family considered inviting a small group from Carbon County, the people who had cared for Evelyn's grave over the years. They felt these community members had earned the right to stand beside them, to witness the restoration of Evelyn's name, and to grieve alongside the family that had searched for her for so long. This merging of two worlds, the family who lost her and the community who honored her, symbolized the power of compassion. Evelyn had not been alone. She had been held, protected, and remembered through generations of strangers, and now her family was joining them in that remembrance. As trial preparations continued, legal experts discussed the challenges of prosecuting a 40-year-old crime. Evidence had aged. Witnesses had lived entire lifetimes since the events, but the prosecutors believed the DNA match, combined with Sierra's own inconsistencies, provided a strong foundation. For the Colon family, the outcome of the trial was less about punishment and more about acknowledgement. They wanted the world to recognize what Evelyn had endured. They wanted the courts to affirm the truth that had been buried for decades. They wanted accountability, not just legally, but morally. As the story gained national attention, others began shining light on the importance of cold case investigations. Evelyn's case, once a tragic mystery, became an example of how modern forensic techniques could offer closure to families who had long given up hope. Her story served as a reminder that unidentified victims are not forgotten, that somewhere, someone is waiting for them. In the final weeks before the court proceedings were scheduled to begin, the Colon family gathered privately once more. They looked through what few pictures survived, the years some recovered from distant relatives, others located through extended family connections. They shared stories, they cried, they laughed quietly at childhood memories. They felt the presence of Evelyn in every word, every tear, every shared silence. They prepared to tell her story in court, not just the story of her death, but the story of her life, the girl she was, the dreams she carried, the love she gave, the fear she faced, the courage she showed, and the truth she left behind. Her story would not end in anonymity. Her name, Evelyn Colon, would live on in her family, in Carbon County, in the true crime community, and in every person who learned about her case. Her daughter's name, Emily Grace Colon, would not be forgotten either. Though their lives were short, their impact had become powerful. They had brought together families, communities, investigators, and strangers. They had sparked conversations, inspired reform, and proven the importance of never giving up hope. As we close this 15,000-word documentary narration, remember that Evelyn's story, though filled with sorrow, is also filled with resilience, love, and truth. It shows us that even in the darkest cases, justice can still be found, names can still be restored, families can still be reunited with answers, and the voices of those who were once silenced can be heard again. Before we conclude, take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button for Dark Case Desk. Your support ensures that stories like Evelyn's continue to be told with dignity, accuracy, and compassion. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering Evelyn and Emily Grace. And thank you for giving their story a place to finally rest. End of the full script.